It was a regular morning at Lincoln High School. The air was filled with the usual chatter of students as they hustled to their classrooms. In room 204, Miss Thompson, the math teacher, stood at the front, preparing for another class. Her desk was cluttered with textbooks and papers, and the chalkboard was filled with equations she had written earlier in preparation for her lesson on calculus. She was known to be a passionate teacher, one who loved to challenge her students with difficult problems, and today was no different. The students had just settled into their seats, ready for another day of learning. But in the corner of the room, there was someone who didn't belong to the class. Sarah, the janitor. She had been working at the school for several years, keeping the hallways spotless and the classrooms in order. Sarah was a quiet, reserved woman, often seen silently pushing her cleaning cart through the halls. She wasn't part of the school's academic world, but she had always been friendly with the teachers and students. Today, as usual, she was busy sweeping the floor at the back of the room, while Miss Thompson prepared to dive into her lesson. As Miss Thompson wrote the complex calculus problem on the board, a mischievous smile crept onto her face. She glanced over at Sarah, who was busy cleaning, and thought, wouldn't it be fun to make a joke out of this? Miss Thompson was known for her playful sense of humor, and she loved to lighten the mood in her class, especially when the students were starting to look a bit bored with the subject. With a chuckle, she turned to the students and said, "All right, class. I've got a challenge for you today. This one's going to be tough. Let's see who can solve this problem the quickest." The students leaned in, intrigued, as Miss Thompson pointed to the board where she had written a complicated calculus equation. Then she glanced at Sarah, who was quietly going about her cleaning duties. An idea struck her. With a grin, she turned to Sarah and said, "Hey Sarah, you've been doing such a great job keeping this place clean. How about you show us your skills with this calculus problem?" She motioned toward the board, where the equation was written, and added with a wink, "I bet you can't solve it." The class erupted into laughter. Miss Thompson's voice was filled with playfulness, and the students immediately understood it was a joke. They all thought it was a bit of harmless fun. After all, Sarah was a janitor. Who would expect her to know anything about calculus? Sarah, however, didn't react the way everyone expected. Instead of laughing or brushing off the comment, she simply looked up from her cleaning. For a moment, she locked eyes with Miss Thompson, then calmly put down her broom. Without saying a word, she walked over to the chalkboard. The room fell silent as everyone watched in disbelief. Sarah wasn't even a student here. She wasn't a teacher. She wasn't someone who people expected to know anything about mathematics, let alone solve a difficult calculus problem. Miss Thompson raised an eyebrow, half amused and half curious, wondering what Sarah was going to do. "What's she going to do?" one of the students whispered to another, both of them watching closely. Sarah stood in front of the chalkboard and took a deep breath. She picked up a piece of chalk and slowly began to write. The class was still and silent, all eyes glued to her every move. They expected her to fumble or perhaps try to make some joke of her own. But instead, Sarah began to work through the problem with a calm and focused demeanor. She didn't hesitate for even a moment. The students' laughter faded away as they began to notice something strange. Sarah wasn't struggling at all. In fact, she was solving the problem with impressive ease. Her writing was neat, her steps clear, and she seemed completely confident in her approach. It was as if she had done this kind of thing 1,000 times before. Miss Thompson, too, was taken aback. Her initial amusement started to fade as she realized that Sarah wasn't just playing along with the joke. She was actually working through the problem. The teacher's eyes widened, and she stepped closer, trying to see what Sarah was doing. This wasn't just any math problem. It was a challenging calculus equation that even some of her brightest students struggled with. But Sarah was solving it, step by step, as though it was the easiest thing in the world. The tension in the room grew as Sarah continued writing, and for the first time, Miss Thompson felt a slight nervousness creep into her. She had made a joke, But now it was starting to feel like something more, something unexpected. Sarah wasn't just cleaning the room. She was about to clean up the teacher's assumptions about who was capable of solving calculus. As Sarah continued to solve the calculus problem on the board, the silence in the room grew even more intense. The students, who had initially been laughing and joking, were now completely still, their eyes fixed on Sarah. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Sarah, the janitor, was solving a calculus problem that most of them would have struggled with. It was as if she had stepped into the role of the teacher, and in that moment, she commanded the room. Ms. Thompson stood there, speechless. She had never imagined this outcome when she had playfully challenged Sarah. The teacher had only meant to make a lighthearted comment, never thinking that Sarah might actually know how to solve the problem. But now, as Sarah's chalk moved swiftly across the board, Miss Thompson felt a sense of awe and respect rising within her. She had always prided herself on her ability to solve complex problems, but she had never considered that someone outside the world of academics might possess the same skills. Sarah's handwriting was neat and precise. She carefully worked through each step of the equation, writing out the solution with the same kind of focus and clarity that Ms. Thompson often admired in her best students. It was clear that Sarah wasn't just guessing. She was systematically working through the problem, applying the principles of calculus as though she had done it 1,000 times before. The class, still in shock, began to exchange glances, whispering among themselves, wondering how this was possible. At the back of the room, one student leaned over to another and whispered, "Is this for real? How does she know this stuff?" The other students shook their head in disbelief, their mouth hanging open. They had never seen anything like this before. In a place where students were supposed to excel in math, here was Sarah, a janitor, someone who they had always seen as an outsider to the academic world, demonstrating an impressive mastery of the subject. As Sarah continued to work, her movements became more fluid and confident. It was clear that she wasn't just performing the steps out of memory. She was deeply engaged in the process. Each time she reached a new part of the problem, she would pause for a moment, take a breath, and then continue, her hand never shaking or faltering. It was a rhythm that spoke of years of practice and understanding. Ms. Thompson could hardly believe her eyes. She had never thought to question Sarah's intelligence. To be honest, the teacher had never really considered Sarah's background in any meaningful way. She had assumed that the janitor was just someone who cleaned the school, someone who had no reason to know anything about calculus. But now, it felt like Sarah was teaching the entire class a lesson in humility. The students watched, rapt with attention. They had always thought of math as something that only a select few could master. They had always believed that success in the subject required a certain type of person, someone with a specific background, a certain level of education. But now, Sarah was showing them that this wasn't true. Talent wasn't bound by job titles, backgrounds, or appearances. It didn't matter what your role was in society. If you had the knowledge and the passion, you could be a genius in any field. By the time Sarah reached the final step of the equation, the classroom was so quiet that you could have heard a pin drop. She took a final moment to check her work, ensuring everything was correct. Then, with a calm smile, she turned to face the class. There was a brief moment of complete silence as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Miss Thompson slowly walked up to the board, her mind racing. She was in awe of what she had just seen, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of embarrassment. How had she not seen this coming? The room was still buzzing with disbelief. No one had expected this outcome. The students, who had once seen Sarah as nothing more than the janitor who cleaned up after them, were now looking at her with newfound respect. Even Miss Thompson, who prided herself on being a tough teacher, was humbled by Sarah's quiet brilliance. Sarah's gaze met Miss Thompson's, and for the first time, the teacher saw her not just as the janitor, but as someone who had hidden talents, someone who had been underestimated for far too long. The math problem had been a joke, but the revelation was anything but. Sarah had just proven that brilliance could be found in the most unexpected places. The teacher and students were left to ponder this new truth. Talent wasn't something you could judge by appearances. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. What started as a lighthearted challenge had turned into a profound moment of discovery. Sarah wasn't just a janitor. She was a mathematician, a person with a remarkable mind who had quietly slipped under the radar for so long. As she stepped back from the board, the class finally erupted into applause, not just for her math skills, but for the lesson she had just taught them all. The applause in the classroom was deafening. The students clapped their hands, cheering for Sarah, who had just shown them a side of herself they never expected to see. But the clapping wasn't just for the math she had solved. It was for the revelation that had just unfolded before their eyes. In that moment, Sarah wasn't just the janitor. She was something far greater, a woman of incredible talent, hidden away behind the labels and assumptions that had always defined her role at the school. Miss Thompson stood frozen, her mind racing. The initial shock of seeing Sarah solve the calculus problem had worn off, but a new realization was settling in. She had underestimated Sarah. Not only had she assumed Sarah didn't have the knowledge to solve the problem, but she had also failed to consider the fact that people like Sarah might possess skills beyond what she had ever imagined. It was a humbling moment for the teacher, who had always prided herself on knowing who the talented students were in her classroom. Yet here she was, confronted by the undeniable truth that she had missed something important. As the applause died down, Sarah stepped away from the chalkboard and turned to face the class. The students, who had once seen her as nothing more than a figure in the background, now looked at her with awe and admiration. Some students, who had been the loudest in laughing earlier, now had their heads down, reflecting on how they had ever thought it was a joke to challenge Sarah. Others were simply staring at her, in shock, as if seeing her for the first time. Miss Thompson cleared her throat, still trying to process what had just happened. The room was quiet, with all eyes on her now. Sarah stood calmly, her face serene, as if this revelation was nothing extraordinary to her. She had known all along that this day might come. But it wasn't about proving herself to anyone else. It was about showing everyone, especially the teacher, what she was truly capable of. Finally, Ms. Thompson spoke. Sarah. Her voice was filled with awe and a hint of remorse. I had no idea. I never knew you could do this. How did you learn all this? There was a mixture of curiosity and guilt in her tone. The truth was, Miss Thompson had always seen Sarah as just the janitor, and while she had always been kind, she had never really taken the time to get to know her. Now she realized how wrong she had been. Sarah smiled gently, her expression calm. "Well, Miss Thompson," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I used to be a math major back in college. But life has a way of changing things. I had to drop out, and I ended up working here. But my love for math never went away. I've kept studying on my own, whenever I had the time." The words hung in the air as the class took it all in. It was a moment of profound revelation, not just for Miss Thompson, but for the students as well. Sarah wasn't just a janitor, and she wasn't just someone who swept floors and emptied trash cans. She was a woman who had once dreamed of a different future, one that involved math and numbers, and despite the challenges she had faced, she had continued to nurture that dream on her own. Her dedication to her passion was clear now, as she stood before them, revealing a side of herself that had been hidden for so long. Miss Thompson felt a rush of emotions: embarrassment, admiration, and respect. She had been so quick to judge Sarah based on her job, assuming that she was someone who had no formal education or intellectual interests. In her mind, Sarah was just a janitor, but now everything had changed. Sarah had shattered those assumptions, proving that intelligence and talent weren't limited by job titles or appearances. The teacher felt deeply humbled, realizing how often people were dismissed simply because of their roles in life. "I never should have assumed," Ms. Thompson whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I had no idea." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, filled with both regret and newfound respect. The students were silent, absorbing the gravity of the moment. They, too, were beginning to realize just how wrong they had been to laugh at Sarah, to assume that she couldn't possibly know anything about calculus. Sarah nodded, her smile warm and understanding. "It's okay, Miss Thompson. I didn't take offense. I just want you to know that anyone, no matter their job or background, can have talents that are unseen. We all have something special inside us, even if we don't always get the chance to show it." Miss Thompson stood there for a moment, her mind still processing everything that had just happened. She had learned a powerful lesson, one that went beyond math and equations. It was a lesson about looking beyond the surface, about recognizing the hidden potential in everyone, regardless of their role in life. The students, once silent and still, now began to nod in understanding. They had learned something important today, not just about math, but about life. And as Sarah stood there, a quiet strength radiating from her, they knew that they would never again judge anyone by what they saw on the outside. They had witnessed the true power of intelligence and humility, and it was something they would carry with them forever. The classroom was still buzzing with the aftershock of Sarah's revelation. The students were processing what they had just witnessed, their minds slowly shifting from disbelief to admiration. They had come to class expecting a normal lesson, but instead, they had experienced something far more profound. Sarah, the janitor, had opened their eyes to the power of hidden potential, proving that talent and intelligence are not confined by labels or appearances. Miss Thompson, still in a daze from the events of the last few minutes, stood at the front of the class. Her eyes were fixed on Sarah, who stood quietly by the chalkboard, her calm demeanor unchanged. The teacher had been humbled, but she also felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had learned an invaluable lesson today, one that would stay with her forever. As a teacher, she prided herself on helping students unlock their potential, but today it was Sarah who had unlocked her own. For a moment, Miss Thompson wasn't sure what to say. The words seemed so small compared to the magnitude of the moment. She had underestimated Sarah, but now she couldn't help but feel an overwhelming respect for the woman who had quietly challenged all of her assumptions. With a deep breath, she finally spoke. "Sarah," Miss Thompson said, her voice soft but filled with sincerity, "you have truly changed my perspective today. You've shown us all that there's more to every person than meets the eye. I've learned something today, not just about math, but about people. Thank you for sharing your incredible gift with us." Sarah, who had been listening quietly, smiled gently. "Thank you, Miss Thompson. I'm just glad I could share a piece of who I really am." Her voice was warm and kind, and there was a sense of peace about her, as if she had always known that the right moment would come to reveal herself to the world. She had never sought recognition or attention for her skills, but today it had come in an unexpected way. The students, who had been silent for the past few minutes, now started to murmur among themselves. They had witnessed something remarkable. The laughter that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by thoughtful conversation. Some students were talking about how they had underestimated Sarah and how they had learned not to judge people by their jobs or appearances. Others were discussing how amazing it was that someone like Sarah, who had been working as a janitor, had such a deep understanding of math. One student, a quiet girl named Emily, raised her hand. "Miss Thompson, do you think Sarah could teach us?" she asked hesitantly, but with genuine curiosity. The class fell silent again, and all eyes turned to Sarah. Emily's question hung in the air for a moment before Sarah's soft laugh broke the tension. "I'd be happy to help," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with kindness. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to teach a whole class just yet." She paused, then added, "But I'd love to help any of you if you ever need it. Whether it's math or anything else, I'll be here." A few students smiled, their faces filled with appreciation. For the first time, Sarah wasn't just the janitor. She was a person they could look up to. She was someone who had inspired them, who had opened their eyes to a world beyond the classroom walls. And more than that, She had shown them that everyone had a story, and sometimes that story was far more extraordinary than anyone could imagine. Miss Thompson, still standing at the front of the room, felt a surge of pride. She knew that today something had changed, not just for Sarah, but for the entire class. They would leave this room with more than just a lesson in calculus. They would leave with a new understanding of the world around them, a new appreciation for the people who walked through their lives, and a renewed sense of respect for those who were often overlooked. Before the bell rang, Ms. Thompson made a decision. She turned to Sarah and said, "I have an idea. We're starting a new tutoring program here at the school. I'd love for you to be a part of it, helping students who are struggling in math. You've clearly got the skills, and I think the students would benefit so much from learning from you." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, but she smiled warmly. "I'd love to help in any way I can." The class erupted into applause again, this time for Sarah's willingness to share her knowledge and help others. Sarah, who had always been humble and quiet, now found herself in the position of being a mentor, a role that, until today, she never could have imagined. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the class, the students began to gather their things, but no one left right away. They lingered, talking quietly among themselves, reflecting on the incredible turn of events that had just unfolded before them. The teacher and the students had all learned something far more important than any calculus equation. They had learned that no one should ever be judged by their appearance or their job title. And in that moment, they all understood that every person, no matter their background, has the potential to surprise the world with their brilliance. As Sarah walked out of the room, the students followed her with their eyes, still in awe of what they had just witnessed. She had shown them that brilliance comes in many forms, and sometimes it takes just one small, unexpected moment to change everything.